I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. In part two of our look at the extraordinary life and career of Jim Brown, we are going to focus on his incredible 9-year career as a fullback for the Cleveland Browns and on his long and remarkable, sometimes troubled life after football. Joining us again is Dave Zirin, sports editor of The Nation, host of the Edge of Sports podcast, and one of our very best writers and observers of sports and the American scene. Dave, welcome. Thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So there's so much to cover in this man's life. After a difficult but phenomenal career at Syracuse University, he's drafted by Cleveland in the first round, the 6th pick overall in 1957. Can you give us a sense of what that first year as a rookie was like?
Jim Brown's first year as a rookie in Cleveland for a team that shared his name because of the coach and part owner Paul Brown, a legendary figure on the NFL scene,
Right.
Was a year of triumph. I mean, he ran for almost 1,000 yards, I believe, in only a 12-game season. He was unstoppable. And he also was somebody who immediately assumed the role of leader on the team, which was very rare for a black athlete at that time. And it was because of, frankly, how he held himself. I mean, the same way he was, as we talked about in the first episode, the same way he was called man at a very young age, growing up in St. Simon Island, Georgia. He was known as the man, really, from the moment he walked out there in Cleveland. All the black players looked up to him, and all the white players respected him. And one of the reasons for that was that he was somebody, even as a very young player, who never got hurt. The most, or I should say, never missed a game for getting hurt. The most impressive statistic in Jim Brown's career to me is 0. That's the number of games that he missed throughout his entire career. And this was somebody who had the ball for roughly 60% of all of Cleveland's plays. This was a time when a tackle in the NFL could mean a clothesline. It could mean getting spiked with cleats in the leg. Things that happened at the bottom of an NFL pile would not be out of place in a Turkish prison. It was a brutal pursuit. And yet Jim Brown never missed a game, and that earned him a great deal of respect. Another thing that helped Jim Brown was the coach, Paul Brown, who was not necessarily Jim Brown's cup of tea in that he was a hyper-disciplinarian who didn't like to hear the complaints of players, who didn't like that a player like Jim Brown had already earned the nickname the locker room lawyer, because he was basically negotiating for the other players to Paul Brown. But the one thing about Paul Brown is that he did attempt to be, to the best of his ability anyway, at that time, a quote-unquote colorblind coach in signing players regardless of the color of their skin. And so Jim Brown, at the very least, didn't have that Ben Schwartzwalder pressure that said, well, I'm skating on thin ice every single day solely because of the color of my skin.
So Jim steps into greatness immediately, right at the start of his first year. And yet, and you mentioned his coach, the legendary Paul Brown, Jim Brown would not have been Jim Brown if he had not clashed in some sense with authority. And so, and I guess the main person of authority is Paul Brown on the Cleveland Browns, but there's also the owner. So talk about his relations with the people running the team.
Yeah, I mean, it was Paul Brown was really the person in charge until a young, brash New Yorker named Art Modell bought a piece of the franchise and eventually a majority piece of the franchise. And Art Modell will figure into Jim Brown's story in dramatic fashion.
Sure will.
Dramatic fashion. But Paul Brown, I mean, there's no other way to put it. He got on Jim Brown's nerves. Because even with Jim Brown's incredible workload, Jim Brown thought that he was being played too much as a fullback and not enough as a running back, which is a distinction, frankly, I think without a difference, given the way the Browns ran their team, which was basically give the ball to Jim Brown and get out of the way. But he didn't like that, and he didn't like the way Paul Brown basically was this top-down authoritarian. and because there were things that Jim Brown saw, because I do think Jim Brown, from an intellectual perspective, was just genius level in terms of how he was able to think about whether it was football or the world. Like he operated on a very, very high intellectual plane, and he saw things that needed to be changed. Yet this was not an era of what they call today player empowerment. It wasn't even an era where there was a union for Jim Brown to actually go through to express his grievances. So instead, he had to organize himself and organize the players and become the locker room lawyer and insist on dress codes, which you have to understand. I think people need to really put themselves in that time. It was an act of rebellion, audacious rebellion, to have the entire team wear coats and ties on the road. I know that sounds like what? That sounds like an act of conformity if you heard of such a thing today. But the fact that it did not come from the coach or from management, but that the players were using it as a statement to say, you will treat us in a certain way, that made it audacious.
Nearly all players would have thought that they could not get away with that sort of thing, and most players could not get away with that. You don't hear stories like this coming from Mickey Mantle or Willie Mays or Hank Aaron or any of the other superstars of that era, just from Jim Brown.
That's why I give Jim Brown the credit, both through this and through his organizing of what were called the Black Economic Unions in the 1960s, which was an effort to link up athletic stars with local Black-owned businesses in cities around the country in a for-profit venture of support of Black businesses based upon athletic salaries. That was the mindset of the Black Economic Union in the mid-1960s. I would argue that both his character in the locker room and his starting of these Black Economic Unions are why you had in the late 60s what's known as the Black Athletes Revolt, with Tommy Smith, John Carlos, Muhammad Ali, and all the people we're familiar with. And without the revolt of the Black athlete, you don't get Curt Flood, and you don't get the opening up of free agency. You don't get the high salaries we see today. So it's no exaggeration to say thousands upon thousands of athletes to the tune of millions, if not billions of dollars, were all created because of the work that Jim Brown primarily, and oftentimes in a lonely way, did in the 1950s and 1960s.
So he played for 9 seasons, and during those 9 seasons, he's better than anyone else playing the game. Just sort of give us the highlights of that 9-year career. How good was it?
Sure. I mean, 9 years, 8 rushing titles in 9 years. 3 MVPs, and it could have easily have been 6, 7 MVPs. It's one of those situations where I think they were just sick of giving it to him every year. And he led Cleveland to the 1964 championship over the Baltimore Colts, and that in and of itself was a big deal because that was the only title that Cleveland, which at the time was known as the City of Champions, that was the only title the city would see until 2016, when the Cleveland Cavaliers won it all in their famous finals against the Golden State Warriors, which is why Jim Brown, even in his old age and having difficulty getting around, was a central part of that parade in Cleveland in 2016. This idea that it had come finally full circle, where the City of Champions, which had been the city of losing for so many decades, not just in sports, but seemingly in life and in industry, in population. I mean, it was all coming back around. And so they used Jim Brown as kind of this totem and symbol of the comeback of the city of Cleveland when the Cavs won it all in 2016.
And then, as you wrote, suddenly and without warning, it was all over. Jim Brown retired. And, that story has been told many times, but I want you to give us your take on how it was that Jim Brown came to retire at what seemed to be the peak of his career.
We have to understand the manhood piece of this that you and I have talked about how when you challenge Jim Brown's manhood in the context of a racist society that he had no patience for. So here's Jim Brown. He's a star for the Cleveland Browns. He's incredibly handsome. He works a microphone with the reporters like nobody's business. And so Hollywood actually recruits him to star as a cowboy. in a movie called Rio Conchos. And it's actually, it does well. A Jim Brown starring Western. It does very nicely. And so he's asked to star or co-star in an even bigger budget film starring Lee Marvin called The Dirty Dozen, a famous film, of course, that has stood the test of time in many respects. Now, The Dirty Dozen is being filmed in Europe. It's this World War II story. And there's this amazing scene where Jim Brown tries to run through bullets, and he looks like no actor in the world. There are weather problems during the filming, and the weather problems make it so there are delays. The owner of the Cleveland Browns, Art Modell, made a decision that he later described as the stupidest decision of his life.
And it was.
And it was. Oh, yeah, absolutely. He fined Jim Brown a minute, insulting amount of money for missing preseason practices. And every preseason practice that Jim Brown missed, he was fined this small amount of money. And Jim Brown found it to be so insulting that after the 9 years that he had put in with the organization, breaking his body, that he would be insulted a pittance while he's filming a movie that was being delayed through no fault of his own,
Right.
that he thought this was ridiculous. So what he did was, a lot of people then say, and Jim Brown quit football. It's much different than that. First of all, nobody quit football back then. Nobody. And the NFL Players Association used to have this saying where they said the only person to walk away instead of limp away from the game of football is Jim Brown. He walked away. And what did he walk into? He walked into Hollywood stardom, and as he said it himself, he walked straight on into Los Angeles and the sexual revolution. And Hollywood and the sexual revolution became a central part of his, and politics became this central part of his life from the late 1960s and through the 1970s. But the thing that I want people to go back and read and find, and you can Google it or it's in the book, is find the actual words that Jim Brown said, which he read in front of reporters at the movie set for The Dirty Dozen, explaining why he was leaving the NFL. And it was all rooted in this idea of being treated like less than a man, and that he would not put up with it.
He would not tolerate it.
Such a radical statement that when Time Magazine wrote about him leaving the NFL, he was wearing Army gear because, of course, he's in the Dirty Dozen, and that was his uniform. And they said in his Army gear, he looked less like a U.S. soldier than like Che Guevara.
And, you mentioned the politics and the Che Guevara aspect and that sort of thing. And it makes me think of another very famous episode, and that was the so-called Ali Summit. And what people mostly remember about that, they remember the surface story, but they remember that great photo of some of the greatest athletes actually ever to play the game, not just some of the greatest athletes of that time. But give us your take us behind the scenes of that photo and what was really going on with the Ali Summit.
People, I'm sure, are familiar with the photo. Google the Cleveland Summit or the Ali Summit. It's an incredibly powerful photo of Jim Brown, Muhammad Ali, then Lou Alcindor, soon to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Bill Russell, all sitting at a table in front of a microphone, and they're framed by about a dozen to 16 or so. It depends on the shot of the frame, of very well-known athletes of the time, even future Hall of Famers like Bobby Mitchell and John Wooten. And they're all standing there, as we are often told, in solidarity and support of Muhammad Ali. This was the athletic community coming together to say, we are against the world of boxing for taking away Muhammad Ali's title for his resistance to the war in Vietnam. And frankly, we stand with his reasoning for why he will not fight in the war in Vietnam. That was what people know about the Ali Summit. Right. What they don't know is that, first of all, the whole reason why people were there in the first place was because it was Jim Brown who placed the individual calls to everybody and organized it. The second thing people don't know, though, is that a lot of the folks were there initially to not support Muhammad Ali. They showed up because they were mad at Muhammad Ali. Because the Black Economic Union, which all those folks in that picture were a part of, owned a piece of Muhammad Ali's contract. And they were upset with him because it would have been so easy for Ali to get his title back. All he would have had to do was say, okay, I'll box at some USO shows and I'll wear some red, white, and blue trunks and say, go USA, and they'll give me my title back. And so Jim Brown said, look, you're all mad at Muhammad Ali. You need to hear his reasoning from his own mouth. And so they said, okay, let's do it. So they all came up to Cleveland to meet with Ali behind the scenes where the cameras were not. And according to what Jim Brown said to me, Muhammad Ali just argued everybody through the floor about his reason. Nobody could assail Ali's logic for why he was refusing the draft. And so then they came out for that summit and they all were of one mind saying we support Muhammad Ali. But that was not automatic at all. And that was because of the weight of Jim Brown to even get them in the room and the brilliance of Muhammad Ali to get them to see his point of view.
And an important point that you seem to make in the book was that they were persuaded by the idea that Ali was so sincere in his beliefs, that this was not any kind of a show or the mere fact that he didn't want to go in the service or whatever, that this was a deep belief on his part.
Absolutely. You know, we forget sometimes that draft resistance in the Nation of Islam walked hand in hand for decades. That was part of being in the Nation of Islam, was a rejection of being in the U.S. Armed Forces. And Muhammad Ali expressed to them in both religious and political and cultural and social terms why his position that he was a preacher meant that he should be classified as a conscientious objector. And that was something the U.S. government laughed at. Like, you're a boxer, not a preacher. You're a boxer, not a proselytizer. And Muhammad Ali made clear to them that his mission was about spreading knowledge, not about just throwing fists. And so they were willing to stand with him at that particular moment. I just find that story so interesting, too, because remember, Jim Brown's whole idea with these Black economic unions, it was about profit. These were not for-profit entities. He saw the profit motive as actually part of an avenue towards Black liberation, towards building your capital as a community. He said to me often about something that a trope that I'm sure you've heard before about, you know, why can't Black people be more like Jewish people? Why can't we be like the Jews? Why can't we pool our money together for the purposes of, like, as immigrant Jews often did, and do that for the purposes of building businesses and getting a bigger piece of the pie in U.S. society? I would argue that there are a lot of problems with that analysis, and, you know, the least of which is, or maybe the most of which is stories like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and showcases of when Black people do build up capital, how that can be violently attacked by a white supremacy that sees that capital as threatening. Jim Brown would have disagreed with that and said, you know, you still have to do it. But it's so interesting to me that the one of the reasons why that whole Ali Summit happens is because he had a lot of athletes in a for-profit enterprise, aka Muhammad Ali, that they were not profiting from.
So, you know, we've talked a lot about masculinity, and obviously that was so important to Jim Brown, and this hyper-masculine sense that he had, you know, it helped drive his astonishing athleticism. It was such an important aspect of his success. It was part of his fight for social justice. But of course, it also had its downsides. And you have a chapter in your book, chapter 7, it's titled Toxic, and then it has the subtitle, Manhood and Violence Against Women. And of course, this is what so many people remember about Jim Brown. And I think a lot of people think about that before they even think about his athletic exploits. And that chapter covers several allegations of very serious violence against women. Talk a little bit in general about this whole issue related to Jim Brown. Why was it such a problem? What was true? What was not true? What, if anything, was exaggerated?
Yeah, two things worth saying about that. That I think I really want to hammer home. I mean, the first is that Jim Brown was violent in his relationships with women. This is a fact. It's also a fact, as Jim Brown said, that he was never actually convicted specifically of violence against women. And it's also a fact that Jim Brown lived in a Hollywood, in a Los Angeles, where fame is the number one industry, and where a lot of allegations against a lot of people never make it to trial. And there's no doubt in my mind that Jim Brown benefited from being Jim Brown in the Hollywood of the 1970s and even in the Cleveland of the 1960s, in terms of getting a lot of allegations pushed under the rug or dropped at trial, or dropped when the police came and spoke to women, as was so common at the time. A woman calls the police meet with them, and then magically the allegation goes away.
Right.
But at the same time, Jim Brown, when he would speak about this, would always say, this is just about them trying to tear down a strong black man. And in my research, there's some of that too, where enemies of his in police departments were more than happy to bring these charges. But he also had friends in police departments willing to cover these things up. So it's very complicated, and kind of an interesting mid-century or mid-late century collision between black power and black freedom, the old rules of white supremacy, and violence against women. Like, it's all a big, messy stew that I try to do my best in the book to untangle, because it is a lot to untangle. You're talking about some charges that went away, some charges where I spoke to the women and they spoke about, how they carry these scars with them to this day. And I gotta say too, I did another interview about Jim Brown with another person, and no need to say their name, but they said when people talk about violence against women with Jim Brown, they have to realize that Jim Brown was a violent person against everybody, that there are a history of violence against men and violence against women, fights, things of that nature, road rage incidents, golf course incidents. And that's true. But at the same time, as a society, there is a reason why we look at violence against women differently than we do interpersonal violence between men, because it backs up certain power relationships that keep women in a position of subservience. Violence has always been a part of institutionalized sexism, patriarchy, whatever you want to have it. And that's something that Jim Brown did not resist. If you were challenging him as a man and you were our art model, you would be responded to, and people of a social justice mindset would cheer. But if Jim Brown was challenged by a woman in his life, particularly by the young women of color in whose company that he often found himself, his response to these much younger black and brown women was oftentimes an open hand.
Tell us what you meant by the subtitle of your book, which is The Last Man Standing. How does that relate to Jim Brown?
Jim Brown is the last man standing for two reasons. One, he was the last member of that 1964 night in Miami when Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, and Jim Brown all got together to speak about what the future of the world could look like for them. And Jim Brown is the last man standing from many of the battles of the 1960s, at a time where we're losing people seemingly every day from that era. But Jim Brown was also the last man standing in terms of a brand of masculinity that he embodied and valorized, and that people, frankly, for decades ate up like catnip before society said, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the way we should classify and diagnose and define what makes a man. Like being able to stand up to power, yeah, that we could say that makes a man. But what about women who stand up to power? Where's the space for them? And not having space for women is something that we're trying to change now as a society. And with that comes having a much different set of ideas about violence against women and how we understand historically the people who engaged with that. The only thing I want to stress before we go, though, Bob, is that with a life like Jim Brown's, it's so important that we not genuflect in its direction, but it's also so important that we not cancel it or ignore it or pretend it didn't happen, because there is so much to learn from a life of Jim Brown, because he basically lived 5 or 6 lives. And in each one, there's a lesson for us to further understand not just the past, but the present and the future. And I hope we don't give that up just because we find aspects of their lives noxious to us from the present day.
Dave Zirin, thank you so much for spending this time with us and giving us your insights into this important figure. He's an important sports figure. He's also an important figure historically in the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, I'm Bob Herbert. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.